Hi, Misha, and changing up speed a bit, let's go back to an old milsurp bolt action. And one of my all-time favorites, the good old British Lee-Enfield, the SMLE Mark III. Specifically, this is actually an example from the Ishapur factory in India, made in 1937. And it's kind of an interesting combination of features. For example, it has the feed cutoff here, but no volley sights. This one newly came in, so it seemed like a good time to revisit the Mark III series, the SMLE series, and just talk about them, because I haven't done an old milsurp video in a minute, so why not? And as always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel so we can actually get 303 to put in this thing, check out the link to the Patreon page. With that, let's get into it. I've done complete Enfield family videos in the past, and I can do one again maybe, but I really just want to dedicate to the SMLE short magazine Lee-Enfield. And this is my oldest example. This is a Mark I updated later to the star configuration, which basically meant it had the newer rear sight to fire the Spitzer ammunition. But we'll get into that. The short in the name refers to the barrel length and overall length. This has a barrel just over 25 inches and an overall length of just over 44.5 inches. And it weighs a little under 9 pounds, about 8.7, 8.8. And would it surprise you to learn this was very controversial at the time? The original long Lee, the SMLE Mark I, and the carbine, well, they didn't work out so well for the Boer War. So by 1901, they were thinking of a new pattern to replace them. And at the tail end of 1902, this basic pattern was in its initial prototype stage. Testing would commence throughout 1903, and there would be a lot of back and forth. Proponents of the design said it was a good idea to have a one-size-fits-all gun. Short enough for cavalry and artillery, but still long enough for infantry. Also, a long enough barrel for range, but not to get in the way. Light enough for anyone to carry. They just thought a one-size-fits-all makes a lot of sense. Proponents were right, but the opponents of it said that, oh, the barrel is it's too short, it's too much flash, too much recoil. You won't get enough range out of a 25-inch barrel. It's too heavy for cavalry, yet for the infantry it's too light. It's just not enough, neither fish nor fowl type situation. These were the older crowd that grew up with black powder. And to be fair, during the black powder days, a longer barrel, 30 inches, really did matter. Not only did it give you the longer sight radius, you needed that extra burn time. But with the newer smokeless powders coming into use in the early 20th century, really you didn't need much more than about this 24-inch, 25-inch barrel length. And keep in mind the 303 cartridge, 7.7 by 56 rimmed, wasn't the most powerful on the block. So, as it turned out, this had plenty of range, and pretty much all of their fears were unfounded. So, in January 1904, the short magazine, Lee-Enfield, SMLE, sometimes written as SHTLE, unfortunate name that, was adopted, the Mark I. And that's what this rifle started off as here. It was the same James Paris Lee operating system as found on the Lee Metford and original Lee-Enfield. It used a detaching 10-round box magazine, double stack, double feed. It retained the magazine feed cutoff from the originals. And this would be one of the first to introduce the charger loading system, at least in this series. There would be this cutout on the receiver and one on the bolt. Kind of an ad hoc way to make chargers work. Not the best, but it'll do. Better than not at all. Flipping her over, it of course inherited the volley sights, the dial sights from the original. Dial up there for a range. Simple flip with 2 positions, up or down, in the back. These are kind of mocked today, but again, they're a little bit of a relic of the early smokeless powder when they really weren't sure just how far it could go, and they could go quite far, and the idea was to have massed infantry, dozens, hundreds, firing at once, kind of a hail of lead, as you were. It actually borrowed the receiver-mounted safety that we saw on and off with the Lee-Metfords and early Lee-Enfields. Instead of the bolt style, we have the iconic Enfield stock with storage compartment. Pretty standard gun. Protected rear sight with windage, elevation, and even micro adjustable settings. Very finely adjustable sight. And of course we have this very iconic full wood forearm with bayonet mount below, and this early style of narrow straight sight protector above. In 1906, older Enfield and Metfords were updated to the newer pattern and were called SMLE Mark IIs. And in 1907, we would get the more iconic version. Adopted in January of 1907, this is of course the quintessential short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark III. This was taking the lessons learned from the Mark Is and just kind of improving things. Now this is my oldest example. It's not especially old as it's early World War I, but it gives you the idea. It retained features like the magazine cutoff, at least initially. They went to an updated version of the 10-round mag, which is, at least in theory, now no longer fitted. It's a universal magazine. With earlier Enfields, the mags would often need to be fitted to some degree to their guns. Now not so much. The forearm was enlarged and strengthened. The original style is kind of thin and rounded. This is more squared off and thicker. The protectors were updated a bit, especially the front sight. And in 1907, we get a new pattern of bayonet. What it supplies you to learn, this is called the pattern 1907 sword bayonet. And it would be used for decades on multiple different firearms. But it started with the SMLE Mark III. Of course, the receiver was another major point of improvement. It was somewhat simplified for mass production, ease of production, but mostly it's the fact that they went to a fixed bridge for the charger system. Using these 5-round chargers to top off. It's just a much better, easier to make, and more secure system for reloading. Of course, you would need 2 full chargers of 303 to load with. Yeah. Now, when the Mark I and Mark III started off, Britain was using the 303 Mark VI cartridge, which was a round-nosed projectile adopted after the Hague and rules against expanding bullets. But in 1910, Britain would go over to a Spitzer cartridge, 303 Mark VII. This was a 174 grain with a flat base projectile. And like most Spitzers, it was just a better shooting cartridge. That's actually when the guns like this one up here received new sights, updated sights, recalibrated for the new round. The first Mark IIIs would also have to get new sights, but since production was very low at that time, most would come out already made for the Mark VII cartridge. Speaking of, production would begin at the Lee-Enfield factory, and then soon go from there. By year's end, the Royal Small Arms Factory at Lee-Enfield would be joined in production of the new Mark III by Birmingham Small Arms BSA and London Small Arms LSA. In 1909, production would start up at the Royal Ishapore Factory in Lee-Enfield, the gun we looked at here to begin with. And then one of the last major manufacturers would come online in 1913 at the Mishaco factory in Australia. And that would mostly be the manufacturers, although there were a few in World War I worth talking about. And speaking of World War I, even though this video is on the SMLE Mark III, the truth is I actually don't own a Mark III. No, I go from an SMLE Mark I ** to actually 3 different Mark III stars. The Mark III originally was made to be quicker and easier to mass produce, and a little more economical compared with earlier versions, and it was. I should say, as a side note, conversions of older Lee Metfords and Lee-Enfields would kind of be done by about 1911, 1912 at the latest. So we're pretty much into new manufacturing. Although there was still quite the controversy over if this was the right way to go for the British, but we'll come back to that in a minute. With World War I kicking off in 1914, well, Britain needed more rifles, and it needed them as quick as possible. It would also, in World War I, adopt a slightly modified version of the cartridge known as Mark VII-Z, written with the Roman numerals. For the first year, production would be more or less the same. But in late 1915, BSA, Birmingham, would introduce the first simplifications under the approval of Mark III Star. And that's what this rifle is here. As you saw, it does have the mag cutoff. And it actually still does have the windage adjustable rear sight. The very first thing to go were the volley sights. They might have been useful, maybe, on the plains of Africa during the Boer Wars, but the trench warfare of World War I really didn't need them, and as you can imagine, that's eliminating quite a few components. Even though these don't use a lot of metal, yeah, they use some, and it takes time to install them. So that was the very first thing to go away. Next would be the mag feed cutoff, as we see with this Lithgow here. After that, we would lose the windage adjustable rear sight, which you can see with both the Ishapore and the Australian guns. And then finally, one of the last simplifications made by 1918, the cocking handle, the cocking piece. As you see with this one, it's smooth with the rounded, knurled edge, much like the original. But they would go to the more iconic square serrated style, quicker to machine and honestly probably easier to grasp. And those would be the principal changes, aside from some other shortcuts as far as material. But they also would not all be implemented at the same time. BSA started the trend. In 1916, they would be followed by Lee-Enfield itself and Ishapore with the simplifications. And in 1918, finally, Lithgow and LSA would introduce the later changes. Now, of course, this does have the cutoff, and it's obviously post-1916, but we'll get to that. There was also kind of a third-party way of building these, called the pedal scheme. Started around 1916, the idea was to outsource manufacturing to multiple subcontractors, bring all the parts together under kind of one giant corporation, and put rifles together. The theory made sense. In practice, it didn't work out. First, it was tried under the name SSA, and then later NFR. Neither system worked great, and only a handful of pedal scheme rifles were ever delivered. I don't have one now, but I have had them in the store before. They look the same, although sometimes the quality of the fit and finish is less than awesome. I would say of the World War I production, the Australian, the Lithgow guns are kind of known for being the nicest. Well, there's still plenty more to talk about here. I got time. Hope you do too. It was actually World War I, the Great War, that secured the Enfield's place. Because before, there was a lot of back and forth. In fact, in 1913, as I'm sure many of you know, the pattern 1913, along with the new cartridge, was actually adopted and was produced in very small numbers by Vickers. But because of the war, it went little of nowhere. Instead, we ended up with the pattern 1914, the P14, which was contracted out to the USA, Winchester, Remington, and eventually Eddystone, and it was chambered for the traditional .303 cartridge. The thing is, by the time the P14 got to the Western Front, the Enfield here had proven itself. There had been concerns about the action, the strength, the accuracy, how it would handle in the mud. It did great for all it was cracked up to be. It did as well as a Mauser, as well as the French rifles, even as well as the American guns, which would end up being the 1917 Enfield, U.S. Enfield, for the most part. The P14 and later 1917 are more of a Mauser system, but with Enfield ergonomics and trim. But by the time they got it, they really didn't need it. The war proved that this gun, they could produce it in good numbers. One nice thing about the way the furniture was designed for the SMLE, they didn't have to use high-grade, large pieces of wood. They could use relatively normal wood that came in relatively small sticks because it uses multiple pieces. The metallurgy was good. The action, while not the strongest in the world, was strong enough for the Mark VII cartridge. The 10-round magazine was handy. The new charger system was working great. I think that's one of the many reasons that this was eventually accepted, that charger system. They just weren't sure. And of course, this 25-inch barrel proved to be more than accurate enough. And it just became an iconic part of what a Tommy was carrying. So it's kind of hard to replace an icon. The poor P14 1917, though. It was a really good gun, but in both cases, both nations, it ended up kind of getting superseded by the gun it was supposed to succeed. Kind of an interesting situation that we've talked about in past videos, and we can definitely revisit. But the story is far from over, because we still have the interwar and World War II periods to get to. It's me back here again. Hard to do an Enfield video and not manipulate the bolt. This cock-on close system with the turn-down handle. Pretty good. It's sometimes been said that you can tell how much wears on a Enfield based on when you pull it up, how much this jumps up. Some of them will come all the way up. It is a really nice system. Although, since the locking lugs are primarily in the back, not the strongest in the world. Nice cocking piece, though. Respectable trigger. Very easy to actuate safety. A true semi-pistol grip, even almost a full 3/4 pistol grip stock. And, of course, famously, a detaching magazine. Although, really, these are only meant to come out for maintenance and cleaning, inspection, what have you. But it was detachable and intended to be topped off by Chargers stripper clips. At least with the later versions. Yeah. Adjustable rear sight. It's a SMLE. With that, let's get back into some history. First off, even though millions of rifles were built in the Great War, production would not stop, either in Australia, Ishapore, or merry old England herself. But it would dramatically slow down, for pretty obvious reasons. One thing that would come back, though, during peacetime, the mag cutoff. That's why this 1937 Ishapore has it, although it would have been one of the last. In England, they quit installing it around 1933. Ishapore was a little bit behind. But they never would reintroduce the volley sights, and they kept the squared-off cocking handle. It makes sense, or striker tail, whatever you'd like to call it. And the rear sight would continue not to have the windage knob. Frankly, it wasn't really useful. And these peacetime interwar production guns would be of extremely high quality, especially the Australian guns. But the course would be a little less straightforward in England. Meet the SMLE Mark V, often called the Trials rifle, although that's not really true. After the war, the English were seeking a way to have a better, more economical, stronger version with better sights for the SMLE, because they couldn't deny that the P-14 sights, the PEEP in the rear, were better for battlefield purposes. Yeah, they weren't as finely adjustable, but you had a longer sight radius and quicker target acquisition, or so I'm told. I've never used a PEEP sight. So that's really what they were starting off with the Mark V here. They added this PEEP. Adjustable. They also modified the receiver, nominally to make it easier to produce, but also they gave it multiple lightning cuts. It does have the feed cutoff again. Like I said, that would return for lots of guns. Of course, the forearm would change because we don't have the rear sight here. And they would actually add a third barrel band setup, or at least system, 2 bands plus the nose cap. And that was to try to strengthen for bayonet use. Because one thing, the Lee-Enfield forearm is not the strongest in the world. So they did that. Otherwise, same infield action, same 10-round magazine. And this was actually the second to last SMLE to really be produced in any numbers of note. Between that year and 1924, roughly 20,000 of these were built. Kind of sounds like a large number for a batch of trials guns, right? Well, that kind of gets into the budget. While the military did not have the authority of the budget to purchase new rifles, it did have the research and development budget, so it enlisted these to try to give these to kind of the front-line expeditionary troops and whatnot, to give them kind of a newer, better gun, and they would go around the world quite a bit. Looking on this side, you can see the lightning cut here. It's a little bit different the way the receiver's cut out. Also, the safety is modified a bit to work with the rear sight versus this one. This one's knurled on the top, but since the rear sight's there, it's on the side. Just a different system. Same basic stock and everything, and the modified form. So while these are nominally trials guns, They were produced in pretty good sized numbers for that, but they were ultimately deemed a failure because this ended up being more expensive to produce, not cheaper. The forearm was not noticeably stronger, and the lightning cut receiver was noticeably weaker, and this rear sight, while it is nice, is pretty thin, and I can definitely see how it could be easily whacked and damaged. Truly I can. So the Mark V, it didn't get the go ahead, but things would move on. Research would continue. The last SMLE to really be built was the Mark VI. Around 1931, Lee-Enfield built roughly 1,000, and these were a hybrid between the Mark V, Mark III, and what will become the number 4 Mark I. Namely, for the number 4, they had a heavier free-floated barrel to try to get some more accuracy. Unfortunately, I don't have a Mark VI. For one, not many survive, and for another, those that do have mostly been converted over into standard number 4s by the military in its service. But they do technically exist, so I definitely had to acknowledge them. One other point, in 1926, the UK, the Commonwealth, kind of changed its naming system. These went from being the SMLE Mark III to the number 1 Mark III, the P-14 becoming the number 3 Mark I, various 22 trainers filling the slot of number 2. So that's why the next gun to be adopted between 1939 and 1941 was the number 4. So in England, the SMLE would be phased out of service during World War II, and so by the time of Korea, it was the number 4. But for Australia and India, things would continue. Now, fun fact, Canada never made the SMLE Mark III. That's a whole story, and it involves Charles Ross and the Ross rifle. So, not going there today because it's way too entertaining to make a sidetrack on. In Australia, number 1 Mark III production, specifically the Star variant here, would ramp up for World War II and would be their main standard infantry gun. It would still be in service during the Korean War, and production would nominally end with the end of the Korean War in 1953, but Lithgow would still assemble guns, especially sporters and sniper rifles, for about another decade until the early 60s, by which time, of course, it was replaced by the L1A1. India would likewise continue production through World War II, and even past independence from England. And no one really knows when Indian number 1 Mark III production ended. What we do know is they did have a further simplified version, though, and these are dated 40s, 50s, even into the 60s. We really don't know. And since we are talking India and Ishapur, I at least have to mention the 2A, or rather 2A1 in this case, because this has an interesting place in history as well. This was actually the last bolt action designed for and issued to a major standing military, kind of capstoning a lot of things. In 1963, Ishapur introduced the 2A, which was a purpose-built Lee-Enfield number 1 Mark III type, meant to fire 7.62 NATO 308. These were not conversions because too much had to be changed. For one, the steel used in the receivers was improved, modern metallurgy. It also needed a whole different extractor because, of course, originally the Lee-Enfield extractor was for a rimmed 303 round. This was using a recessed rim or rimless round, if you prefer. They also added a cross bolt to the stock to reinforce it for recoil. It does have some of the later Indian simplifications, for example, to the front sight here. It also has the stamped swivels something you found on Indian guns. These can also be milled, they don't have to all be stamped. And it has a unique magazine purpose designed for the NATO cartridge. Either 10 or more often 12 round capacity. Flipping it over, you can see the cross bolt here in the stock. Standard receiver bridge. It would take NATO compatible clips, chargers. Interestingly, it doesn't use a Lee-Enfield butt plate. Rather, it uses the Indian L1A1 copy called the 1A1's butt plate. Still has a trapdoor in it though. And here. Now the original 2A used the same 303 sights calibrated in yards. The 2A1, introduced in 1965 or 66, depending on who you ask, went to a new purpose-built rear sight in meters, 800 to be exact, for the new NATO cartridge. So that's really a difference, 2A, 2A1 sights. And these would be built until at least 1974 with about 250,000 made. And they would be issued to the Indian Army. Granted, it was mostly for training, reserves, backup, but some were used in the border skirmishes and wars against Pakistan. So they did see combat. On top of that, the Indian border guards often carried these, and many Indian police departments had these. In addition to some really cool guns that were actually original 303s that were shot out, they had their bores, bored out to .410 caliber shotgun and used a blown out 303 casing for a .410 shell. And they were single shots. Kind of interesting job there. A lot of those were converted by U.S. importers to fire standard .410 as well, but not all. So kind of be mindful of that. No one really knows when Ishapur finally built its last Enfield. It was in the 70s. Some even claim the 80s. We don't really know. Probably never will. Not the best record keeping. Here they are, all lined up, at least to the best of my ability on this table. From the original Mark I types through the various Mark IIIs made in England and India and Australia, to the trials guns, to the frankly underrated 2A1s. The short magazine Lee-Enfield is the iconic Enfield. Not to take away anything from the number 4 and number 5. And I definitely like the Longley and the cavalry variant, but this is the Enfield. It's said that roughly 17 million Lee-Enfield type guns have been produced. Of those, the vast majority are the SMLE type. But we really don't know how many. It's all estimations. Too much time's gone by, and we don't have a clue how many survive today. But they do pop up in wars all over the place. They certainly did during the Cold War. They are strong. Enough. Kind of on that edge, but enough. They're easy to actuate. They hold 10, or in this case 12 rounds. Good trigger. Okay sights. They're World War I era sights. A lot of guns had the same kind of maybe overly finicky rear sights for World War I. Look at the Springfield. It really is up there with one of my absolute favorites, and they're a lot of fun to shoot as well. Just don't do it one-handed with a jungle carbine. But since this 1937 Ishapur came in, I don't know, hope you had fun, and I wanted to do a Milsurp video, and this seemed the most fitting. What do you think? Let's wrap it up. Well, hope you enjoyed kind of this trip revisiting the Enfield. I've had number 4s, number 5s. I really do like the old long leaves. But there is just something about the classic World War I era short magazine Lee-Enfield. Of course, Britain would switch over to the number 4 not long after this particular rifle was built in India, but India and Australia would continue making the Mark III, whereas Canada and England would switch over, and the US would join in for a minute with the Savages. But that's a story for another day. I can't tell you why I felt like revisiting it. Again, you haven't seen this exact rifle before, and I do think it's interesting to see the feed cut off so late in production. But the truth is, it's a rainy old day out, so it just kind of seemed like a good town to visit wood and steel. You can also tell that the quality of the machining on these Indian guns was very, very good in the 1930s. So with that, I'd love to hear about your Enfields, which ones you might own, some interesting variants. Because in some ways, each one is kind of individual and unique, and there are a ton to really get interested in for a collector. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And like I said at the beginning, if you'd like to help support the channel, check out the link to the Patreon page. But if you can't, that's cool too. It's a working man's world, right? With that, this is Misha, and we'll catch you very soon next time.